All right, we are live with myself, Dr. Elliot Kamenetsky, and Dr. Cameron Sepa, right? It's Sepa,
Sapal,
or
yep.
Sepa?
Yeah.
Sepa. All right. So, Dr. Sepa, can I call you Cameron for this?
Sure. Yeah.
As the CEO of Maximus Tribe, a company which offers cutting edge doctor prescribed protocols for men to optimize energy, drive, and performance. He's a licensed psychologist who specializes in coaching CEOs and is a clinical professor at UCSF Medical School. Did I get that right?
Yep. All good.
All right. So I met Cameron on Twitter, right, where some
That's
people
right.
meet these days. And he was just an icon on the computer, but I found all of his tweets to be really interesting and unique. And I feel like very often in the psychology Twitter world, it's almost like an echo chamber, and you hear the same recycled opinions and thoughts. And I thought Cameron's voice on Twitter was very interesting and genuine and unique. And we got to talking, and he had me on his show, and I'm so glad to have him on mine. So thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome. It's great to reconnect and chat again. It was great to have you on my podcast, and I'm awesome. It's glad to reciprocate on yours.
All right, wonderful. Uh, all right. So I was having internet issues a little earlier today. If this cuts out, I'm going to be posting this video to my various social media accounts, so you could check it out there later. But hopefully things will go smoothly, and let's roll with it.
Let's do it.
All right. So psychologists do, so many things, but not
Mhm.
many are, CEOs of like a really interesting company. So I'm curious, like, how did you get into this gig?
Yeah, I guess I'm a bit of a renegade
Hmm.
psychologist, if you will. That's probably why my Twitter persona is interesting. It's
Yeah,
sort of the professional manifestation of my disagreeableness. So I like to post a lot of unpopular opinions.
I
I like
love
to say that
unpopular opinions.
yeah, I like to say I'm professionally disagreeable and personally very agreeable, but
Okay.
it's I don't know. Unfortunately, the Twitter algorithm reinforces spicy takes, if you will. So I try to be nice, but yeah, I kind of be kind of purposely a little bit provocative. So it's kind of fun. At least it's entertaining, I would say. But how did I kind of get down to this path to your question? Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It wasn't pre-planned, to be honest. If you told me like a decade ago I'd be working in tech, I would have thought I made some wrong left turn somewhere career
Right.
wise. So I mean, I trained as most clinical psychologists do. I went to an APA accredited PhD program at UCLA, which is phenomenal. It's the top clinical psych program in the country. You're expected to be a research professor. And it's kind of a weird thing because half the graduates do end up practicing, but it's certainly frowned upon because you're supposed to follow in the prestigious footsteps of your PI and continue to publish. So I think I realized very early on in my graduate program that was not the path that I wanted to take,
Hmm.
much to the chagrin of my PI and advisors who still do not list me on their alumni website. So, but it is what it is. I guess that maybe that's where my black sheep days started. The irony
Uh-huh.
of that whole thing, by the way, though, is like later on, they had students who wanted to go into industry and they invite me to their lab to give a talk about careers in industry. So I think I've slowly been welcomed back into the fold now that I'm
Right.
successful. But I thought to myself in grad school, well, okay, if I don't want to be a research professor, what do I want to do? And I was like, well, I'd like to go into clinical practice. Obviously, we're trained as clinician scientists, and like I said, half our grads do anyway. So I did that. I worked in the VA system. Really enjoyed, obviously, doing diagnosis and treatment with military veterans. I didn't love the bureaucracy, obviously, working for the federal government,
Yeah.
and also just had like a very interesting, like every VA is different. I had some really wonderful experiences in VAs and maybe some not so wonderful ones. And I kind of had an interesting observation of there's like almost like two types of people who work for the government. There are people who work there for work-life balance. Like I worked there, it was 8:30 to 4:30 every single day. I couldn't check my email at home. So talk about work-life balance. Like I
Yeah.
was home at like 5 o'clock and there was no work to be done. And it was great. And I was like, if I don't finish my notes in the office, they're not, they're not going to be done at home. So I think for a lot of sort of family-oriented people or people who want work-life balance, it draws actually great, but let's say balanced people. And then it also draws people who, quite frankly, are so pathological that they could not be employable anywhere else, and they can hide out basically in the federal government because they're unfireable. And you literally get both types. So I have wonderful supervisors that I still keep in touch with, and there's some people that I would walk to the other side of the street because I used to work with them, and I was just like, this is a weird place, and this is probably not for me. And as much as I think sort of like the Harvard environment in which I was educated that has its own annoyances in terms of social climbers. I was like, I kind of just miss being around smart, ambitious people who aren't just clocking in and clocking out. So I was kind of thinking about, okay, I don't want to continue working in the VA system, even though I like the patients, I just didn't like the system. And I had an interesting sort of experience. I was running a behavioral diabetes management program for a VA hospital, and
Yeah, sorry about that.
back. And a patient of mine came up to me after group. He was doing really well. And he's like, hey, doc, I can't come back anymore. And I was like, why not? You're doing really well. And he's like, well, to be honest, I have one car and I have 5 family members and I cannot drive it to the hospital every week. And I was like, oh, like it broke my heart because I was like, that's not a medical issue. That's a socioeconomic issue.
Yeah.
And that was that. And he never came back. And I was like, that's a bummer. The VA at the time was actually testing for research purposes telemedicine, but it was only like you had to live like 200 miles away from a VA in order to be able to go to a satellite clinic to do what we're doing now.
Right.
Telemedicine was controversial. And we were experimenting with remote blood pressure cuffs. People were monitoring that every day. And if their blood pressure got too high, a nurse would call them. And I was like, look, this is the future. It's just going to it's going to take medicine 10 to 20 years, honestly, to adopt this technology. But it's clear that for non-procedural care, especially what psychotherapy is, we're not touching people, we can clearly do this. And I think their emerging research evidence basically established it's quite frankly just as efficacious. Yes, it's great to be able to get full body language and that kind of emotional bond in person. But on the other hand, if you have practice in private practice, my compliance rates are much better with telemedicine for exactly the issues in terms of avoiding transportation issues.
The rain doesn't stop therapy.
Exactly. So I was like, look, telemedicine is the future of medicine, and I want to make my career about that because I want to make healthcare accessible and scalable to millions of people. So literally, as soon as I finished my fellowship and got licensed, I moved out to Silicon Valley. This is 2012, and about a decade ago, and I helped start a company called Omada Health, which basically took the behavioral diabetes management program that I was doing. I did my fellowship in behavioral medicine, or what's called kind of clinical health psychology, and then essentially created an online version of that. So Omada basically created online weight loss programs and has helped 500,000 people lose 5 million pounds, which is way more than I could have done sticking around in the VA system.
Yeah, wow.
So that was kind of my foray into entrepreneurship, and the bugs struck me, and I've basically been an entrepreneur since. But I still one day a week maintain I still teach. I train 4th-year psychiatry residents at UCSF, and I maintain a private practice with CEOs and VCs, which was also kind of serendipitous. I never intended on working with that population, but it's basically who I professionally work with and hang out with. And obviously they need to have their mental health needs as well. So people kept asking me, do you still see patients? And I was like, yeah, every once in a while. And just word of mouth and referrals, that practice ended up sort of building out. So yeah, to be honest, it's like, it wasn't a lot of forethought and prior planning. It was right place, right time, and dumb luck. But also I think maybe because my mom was a public health nurse and I always cared about, public health and accessibility of care. Maybe those seeds were kind of planted at a very early age. And so when the opportunity and the right time of sort of being around Silicon Valley came about, I went to school with Mark Zuckerberg, in fact, of Facebook fame. It kind of opened my eyes to the possibility of doing a lot of this stuff.
Oh, cool. That's really fascinating. And so I was curious, like, what's a day in the life like for a CEO who's a psychologist? I'm so curious.
Yeah, because people always ask me, like, "How the hell do you have 3 jobs and do you sleep?" And the
Right.
answer is yes. I actually track my I got 7.86 hours of sleep last week, so
Almost 8.
yeah, we're doing pretty good. 7 to 9, I think,
Yeah,
is acceptable. We
that's
actually do it,
great.
ironically, as, it's kind of like a voluntary employee challenge at the company. I'm actually really big. Every psychologist knows, obviously, like, the importance of sleep, but, weirdly, in the corporate world, it's very, like, backwards, I would say, in terms of, like, self-care and health. There's this very masochistic, work hard, don't sleep culture, and I'm like, "Look, we're not doing that here." So I encourage people to track their sleep. I obviously try to be a good role model, do the same. So no, it's the honest answer is, like, I spend most of my time running the company, right? Tuesday afternoons I teach, and then my private practice is on Sundays, which is, delves into, what would otherwise be my personal time. So I don't kind of mix essentially my different jobs, that they're at sort of different times, but there's no
Mhm.
really typical day. Being a CEO of a company, you just wear many different hats. Obviously, I spend a lot of time managing. We got about 25 people at the company now, so managing them, hiring, and recruiting is like a big part of my job. Um, then there's just a million different things. We have people who are the heads of product operations, but there's still a lot of sort of supervision. But I think kind of what it comes down to is like, it really comes down to like setting a vision for the company, um, and making sure you have the right people and processes in place to make that a reality. And so there's a lot of things that goes into. I'll literally be on the phone with our pharmacies and talking about product development one day. I have to talk to a PR person about the announcement of our Series A financing. I'll meet with our investors. So it's a very eclectic. So I think if you like novelty and stimulation and your high openness to experience, entrepreneurs tend to be very high in openness to experience. I certainly am when I do my Big Five personality test. So
Mhm.
for me, maybe that and the fact that I do multiple jobs is a natural outgrowth of my personality. So I don't know. I guess that my answer is there is no typical day. You wear so many hats and have so many different responsibilities because there's so many functions of the company, but that's also what makes it lively and interesting. And it's also why I kind of like doing both.
Right.
Obviously, private practice clinical work is much more focused and similar, even though obviously there's variability in terms of your patient experiences. But like one psychotherapy session to the next is more similar than me talking to an investor and I don't know, like dealing with employee issues. So
Yeah, right.
I get a little bit of the stability and the variety in both
Yeah,
capacities.
I love novelty. It sounds really great. Um, cool. So, like, transitioning into, well, I guess before we get into like men's health and men's mental health, um, so how does Maximus Tribe help men and men's health issues, and including mental health?
Yeah, it's a great question. So just to give a background on what my company is. So the company's
Yeah.
Maximus. We call the community Maximus Tribe is sort of the
Okay. The
the
company's
outgrowth of
Maximus.
that. But
Got
yeah,
it.
you can check it out at maximustribe.com. Unfortunately,
All right.
maximus.com was taken.
Okay.
So Maximus is basically a consumer telemedicine company that focuses on health and hormone optimization. And one of the interesting outgrowths of my private practice, I'm much more holistic, I would say, than most psychologists are, in that I obviously use evidence-based therapy as the foundation for the work that we do, but I also help optimize people's nutrition, exercise, sleep, focus, relationships, even supplementation. I have a lot of expertise that comes from working at my previous companies in those realms.
Mhm.
And so, I delve into that stuff as well. And I would say 80% of my CEO and VC clients actually don't meet DSM criteria for an Axis One mental health disorder. So a lot of them come more for optimization and performance enhancement, which
Mhm.
kind of I guess you could call it like humanistic slash positive psychology, but there's almost not a lot of precedent for it. Maybe
Mhm.
some organizational psychology as well. Um,
Yeah. Was that formerly in like the realm of coaching?
yeah, I hate the term because, and like, yeah, everyone can call themselves a coach. I'm like, look, I guess I call myself a performance psychologist, in
Okay.
that I'm a psychologist. I do psychotherapy. Fundamentally, all the skill sets of conceptualization and treatment planning are the same. You're just basically working with a much higher functioning population.
Mhm.
That's essentially what it boils down to. But I think the ethos of wanting to be better, or to kind of focus on performance, trickles into Maximus, and that we're really a performance enhancement company. We do treat, just like psychologists do, clinically diagnosable issues such as secondary hypogonadism, which is basically low testosterone. But we also treat folks who aren't low testosterone and simply want the performance enhancing benefits of optimizing their testosterone. I think one of the unfortunate issues with the what I call the sick care system, not the healthcare system that we have, is when it's sort of driven by insurance, they only want to treat people who are really sick. So like in the United States, if your testosterone is not below the 2.5 percentile, you technically do not get a diagnosis of secondary hypogonadism. But if you're 3rd percentile, you're probably feeling good, or certainly not optimal. But insurance will say, oh, you're not sick enough or severe enough that we're going to justify reimbursement. That's why obviously 90% of psychologists don't take insurance, because they don't want to deal with that nonsense. Obviously, psychotherapy is beneficial for personal growth beyond severe depression and anxiety. Same thing. Hormone optimization is helpful for people beyond just having serious hypogonadism. Unfortunately, I think the thing that people don't realize is testosterone has dropped 50% in the last 50 years. Not just due to obesity and metabolic disease, but due to endocrine disrupting chemicals, because our environment is highly polluted. So even what is considered the 2.5 percentile, what's the so-called reference range in labs, has literally shifted. The top of the reference range used to be 1,200, 1,100 nanograms per deciliter. Now it's like in the 900s. So what we're even considering the cutoff for pathology is just keeps shifting lower and lower, because we're just getting sicker and sicker as a population. So we always say as a clinic, we treat symptoms, not numbers. We do track the numbers. We actually do at-home lab tests so we can measure your testosterone and other hormones. But we look at symptoms, and typical symptoms that are associated with testosterone are motivation, drive, confidence, work and athletic performance, libido, and sexual function, and mood. And if you sort of have the syndrome of these kind of symptoms, it may be associated with low testosterone. So we do both the biomarker testing and obviously the patient-reported symptom assessment, and we combine that. And our doctors prescribe basically a prescription medication. It's actually very novel because it's not testosterone replacement therapy. So some people may have heard of that. That's basically injecting testosterone. Problem with it is when you take external testosterone, it shuts down your natural testosterone production, and you're basically shutting off your testicles. They shrink and you become infertile. So it's not a great solution for basically anyone under 50 or who wants to maintain their fertility, according to our advisors. So what we do is actually the opposite. We actually use what are called SERMs, selective estrogen receptor modulators. What they do, they're basically prescription estrogen blockers. And when you block the estrogen receptor in selective parts of the body is like, oh, testosterone turns into estrogen through an enzyme called aromatase. I need to produce my own, more of my own testosterone. So it actually stimulates your own natural testosterone production, maintains or increases testicular volume, and it actually is derived from a fertility drug. So it actually maintains or increases fertility. So it's actually safe for 18-plus-year-old healthy men because there's no dependence, there's no tolerance, there's no shutdown, and it's stimulating, like I said, your own natural production. So I actually still consider it relatively natural or natty, to use bodybuilder slang. So we provide people with that prescription protocol, and then coming from the health psychology world, we also do health coaching. So we optimize people's diet, exercise, sleep, and focus, stress management. Because, as you know, if someone's reporting libido issues, is it because of their low testosterone? It's also probably due to excess stress and cortisol. They probably have some relationship or intimacy issues that are going on. And so we really, I think ethically, clinically, we try to be holistic in addressing people's needs all across the board. But, we kind of have a med first approach in the sense that we do lead with medication. Unfortunately, Americans love magic pills. But I think in this particular case, testosterone is really interesting because it's a hormone that's very motivational in nature. And so the argument that I make and what we've seen in our clinical experience is it's actually synergistic with health behavior change, because when you increase motivation and drive, they're more likely to actually incorporate all the changes that every single doctor and psychologist tells people to do: lose weight, exercise, eat right, blah, blah, blah. People don't do it. And so the combination therapy tends to be particularly enhancing. So that's essentially kind of what we call the King protocol in a nutshell.
Okay. And there's also a Lever protocol?
Yeah. So we have a sexual enhancement, essentially, protocol. So most people are familiar with ED medications. They're a class of drug called PDE5 inhibitors. Essentially what they do is they increase blood flow. And so obviously improves erectile quality. Now, generally, though, if you don't have ED, there's no point of sort of taking ED medications for the most part. But we actually combine it with another drug called bremelanotide, or PT141. It's actually FDA approved for hypoactive sexual disorder in women, but it actually works just as well in men. And it's actually a libido enhancer. So instead of just making you hard, it actually improves libido and makes sex better. So you can actually take it, if you will, cosmetically as well, in terms of even if you don't have ED, you just want better sex, it enhances that. And what's really interesting is there's a bunch of research actually on the use of PDE5 inhibitors for other reasons. A lot of people actually, interestingly, in the athletic community, like taking it because it's not just increasing, blood flow to the penis, but it increases blood flow to the muscles and the brain. So people use it to enhance their gym pumps. It increases muscle protein synthesis. So a lot of the people sort of, if they lift weights, may be familiar with sort of like nitric oxide boosters, but PDE5 inhibitors are much more effective, essentially as a prescription strength version of that. So it enhances basically your ability to lift weights. And then what's really interesting, I think this is very preliminary, more research needs to be done, but because it enhances cerebral blood flow, there actually are randomized studies that show that it enhances cognitive functioning on a lot of the measures that psychologists are familiar with, such as the MoCA. So there's enhancements in working memory, attention, processing speed, et cetera, using PDE5 inhibitors, which is interesting because, people just think about them as ED drugs, but obviously if you're familiar with psychiatry and pharmacology, medications aren't really meant for any particular purpose. They're marketed for particular purposes. But, Viagra, ironically, originally was a cardiac drug, and they found on accident a side effect was enhanced erections. Right. And then they said, okay, we're going to market it for that purpose. Yeah. But there's interesting associational data, and ironically, on Viagra, showing that they have people who take them have lower rates of Alzheimer's. And so there's very promising potential anti-dementia effects. Again, this is all preliminary associational data. Randomized control trials need to be done. But I think, kind of our thesis is, I think there's a lot of potential in sort of using medications off-label. They're already FDA approved, relatively safe, but using them for new indications that particularly have to do with performance enhancement and optimization for not just people who are sick, but just people trying to be better.
Right. So, you mentioned so many areas that people, call you up to enhance in their lives. Who would you recommend, check their testosterone level, right? Like what types of things, in their life should they look for to say like, I should actually get a test, to see what's going on?
Well, I actually think all men should get their testosterone and their blood sugar levels, if those two in particular, checked. Why is that? Well, let's say start with the diabetes side. 12% of adult Americans have diabetes, 37% have prediabetes. So basically 1 in 2 men have diabetes or are well on their way. And most people, 89% of people with prediabetes aren't even aware of it because blood glucose testing is not routine standard of care. Unless you are like above 40 and have hypertension, I believe, are the latest guidelines. But I think it's silly. Basically, if you're overweight, you're sedentary, or you have a family history of diabetes, you should absolutely get a fasting plasma glucose and or an A1C test. Always get an annual physical with your doctor. Ask your doctor, and then if they ask why, just be like, I have one of these aforementioned reasons, or I just want to check my blood sugar levels. I think it's a really smart idea to do so to make sure that you're not progressing along the diabetes spectrum. So one, definitely do that. And then testosterone is the same thing. It's not, unfortunately, measured as part of routine care. So most doctors / insurance companies don't like it if you're just like, oh, I'm just curious. But, if you have some symptoms that are associated with it, as I mentioned, energy, low energy or fatigue. Now that can be caused by a lot of different things, but hormones are potentially one of them. In addition to sort of thyroid things, it's not a bad idea to get a routine thyroid test as well. Get your lipids checked. That's just part of your routine annual blood work. I don't think people, it's really sad that most people don't even have a primary care physician, much less take advantage of the free annual physical that most health plans offer. Yeah. But I do think doing like routine comprehensive blood testing, we're not talking about going nuts here, but once a year, I think it's smart. Just get your lipids checked, your hormone checked, your thyroid checked, your blood sugar checked. I think it's generally a good idea, just given the rate of these issues these days. But as I mentioned, if you have low energy, if you are having some potential mood issues, you're having a decrease in libido or sexual functioning, a decrease in motivation, drive, confidence, decrease in work and athletic performance, those are all symptoms. Now, like I said, they could be symptoms of a lot of different things. So obviously your physician and or psychologist should do a good differential diagnosis, but getting the blood work can at least point out whether that could be a contributing factor to it. So I would say if you're experiencing any of those things, it may be a good idea to get it checked. I actually encourage people, though, even if you're like in your 20s feeling great, you should still get your testosterone checked for a different reason, which is almost as like a biometric pass. And what I mean by that is if you're young and healthy, you should know what your testosterone levels are when you're feeling good, so that if over time it changes,
you get a baseline.
You're like, okay, now I've departed from my baseline. Exactly. And so many guys, they're like test when they're feeling not so great in their 30s or 40s, they're feeling the effects of aging, and they're like, I don't know, is this number good or bad? And you're like, well, it's relative, but it's most relevant if you have your own baseline. So that's why I actually encourage people to test it over time, because here's the interesting thing. Testosterone does decline with age, right? They know that. We know that in the associational studies, but it's often probably due to chronic illness. People literally get obese as they age. They put on about 1 to 2 pounds a year, the average American. And so that's probably what's contributing to the testosterone decline. If you're actually a healthy guy who maintains their weight and their fitness, you can actually maintain your testosterone levels completely flat into your 50s and 60s. It's not a necessary decline necessarily actually due to aging. So that's why it's also useful to kind of monitor over time and make sure that it's staying steady optimally. And if not, then you can ameliorate it.
That's really interesting. So, just like zooming out a little bit, it sounds like you really work a lot with men and really are very informed about the issues that they face. What would you say is the biggest mental health challenges facing men today?
Yeah, that's a great question. We almost use a variation. This is an interview question with the company too. Well, I think there's a couple things. First of all, there's a mental health issue in terms of access and seeking of mental health, right? That's like the macro issue, in the sense that one, our mental health system is totally messed up. We don't have good access, obviously, to mental health care. The quality and variability of psychotherapists in the United States is egregiously bad. There's a lot of for-profit institutions that churn out graduates without proper training. And there's very little supervision that happens even once you're licensed. And so I hear just so many anecdotal experiences from people who are like, oh, I've tried therapy and I had a terrible experience. And I was like, what was your therapist doing? Did they have an orientation? Any orientation? Did they have a plan? Just like basic things. It's like, regardless of how you practice, it's like, did they give you a essential oils. Yeah. Did they give you a diagnosis? Or if they're not into diagnoses, that's fine too. But like, did they give you an explanation or an understanding of what your problems may be? Was there a plan to address that? Did you find benefit? What did you do? And they can't answer these basic questions. Like, that's not quality therapy. So that's an unfortunate thing. And I think it unfortunately sometimes turns people off because they may have tried it once, had a bad experience. And I was like, well, you just had a shitty clinician, unfortunately. It's not that mental health treatment or therapy doesn't work. And then thirdly, there's obviously a huge stigma around particularly men seeking mental health as a weakness, flaw, foible, which, I think we're still trying to undo as a society. I think there's a terrible tragedy going on of male influencers that are discouraging men from seeking therapy. Now, the funny thing is there's always been a stigma, and I don't think we'll ever get rid of it because the association is with pathology, right? Therapy, you only go when you're sick. But I think that I actually talked about this in my radio show yesterday about sort of like the current masculine influencers tend to be very harsh and cold. There's like very few warm ones anymore. And I was like, dude, you can be masculine and warm, but you think about David Goggins, Jocko Willink, even Jordan Peterson, who's a psychologist, not particularly warm. I think he's emotionally effusive, and I appreciate the fact that he can show his grief and his emotions. But it's not warm and fuzzy. That's not the feeling that I get, even though I love his work. And I was like, I think now, while he obviously does encourage mental health therapy, there's a lot of folks out there like Andrew Tate and other people who are very popular right now who discourage men from seeking treatment. And I think it's a terrible tragedy and shame when particularly this younger generation Z generation is told it's basically unmasculine, and if you particularly are a little bit more right-leaning and conspiratorial, which I think social media has made people, they think it's almost like demasculinizing to go to therapy, or that they're going to propagandize you. And honestly, some of the paranoia may be justified in that. Certainly good therapy is not about that. But I do think if you look at literally the advertising of the graduate programs for psychology and social work, they particularly emphasize social justice, which we can have a debate about the utility of that. But once you start infusing sort of social, your personal, social, political agenda into therapy, the boundaries and the ethics of that become very questionable. And I think it's discouraged a generation of men because they're afraid of being, programmed from seeking therapy. So I think that's a huge issue. Is first and foremost, so we are doing an incredible disservice to men by not offering good care or a place where they feel like they can be trusted and heard and respected as men, without propaganda, quite frankly. So I don't actually blame men for doing that. But I always tell people, look, this is my analogy. It's just like the dating market. The dating market is terrible right now, right? But here's the good
I'm already
news.
out of the game.
Yeah,
It's been a while.
The good news is you only need to find one person. Even if there's a lot of bad quality and options out there, you only need one. Dating is an exception game. And fortunately, finding a good psychologist is the same. 90% of them can be batty, in fact. Now, it makes your life harder. You got to search more, do more research. But in the end, you just need to find one and stick to them. Like, once you find a good one, don't let them go. Can't put a ring on your therapist, but you know what I mean? So it's not an excuse either. So I always tell people, like, look, this is the unfortunate reality of the market, but it doesn't matter. You just find a good one, and it's going to take a little bit of work. And once you do, you can do great work together. So it's not an excuse not to get it. So that's a huge issue. So let's get that out of the way. What is the other sort of major mental health issues? I think we live in a modern day society that's basically outright hostile to masculinity. Literally, with this toxic masculinity narrative that's gone about, it's very really contrary to the principles of psychology, in which, psychology 101, one of the things you teach patients is, you don't blame, like in basic interpersonal dynamics, you don't like tell your partner they're a terrible person, but that behavior that they did, was maybe not appropriate, right? You don't overgeneralize. And I think the same thing, it's not something inherent about masculinity that's toxic. Obviously, there are toxic behaviors that both men and women do, that we should certainly repudiate and remediate through proper education and counseling, and maybe even efforts that we do as a society. But, the irony is we never use the term toxic femininity. Nobody uses that term, right? Because there's a weird double standard that's happening, and blaming sort of masculinity in men for the ills of, quite frankly, a few bad apples in the bunch. And more importantly, it's just not an effective behavior change technique. Telling men that there's toxic masculinity gives an implication there's something inherently toxic about their nature that they need to hide or shame, which I don't think has reduced sexual harassment, sexual assault, discrimination, or any of the misogyny or any of the other things. I think it's in fact just driven the behavior underground, which I think is actually truly much more toxic than being able to have an open dialogue about it in this sort of era of cancel culture where we can't have this discussion, right? I actually had a whole TikTok video that I said the same thing. I was like, I don't believe in toxic masculinity. I believe in toxic behaviors. And it's a much more useful approach, especially as a behavioral psychologist. Let's talk about the problematic behaviors, not talk about problematic masculinity. People had an interesting and controversial debate about that.
In the comments?
Yeah, people go nuts.
Sure.
A lot of mostly supportive, I would say, but there's people who get angry about it, and social media obviously is not a great era for nuanced or civil discussion, unfortunately. But I think the macro trend of that is, I think men are very confused these days because of these mixed messages, right? You have these male influencers that are like, be masculine, don't go to therapy, be tough, get up at 4:30, work out hard. And yes, really motivating. And then you have, the other side telling them your masculinity is toxic. You need to learn how to be an ally, use your personal pronouns. And I don't even think men on either side of this debate, know what the hell to make of all this. And I think the real genesis of this is there's a lack of really good male role models in modern American society, both at the familial level, because obviously the divorce rate, 1 in 2 men probably were not even raised by a father who was not either literally physically present, nor if they were, maybe they weren't emotionally present. And certainly in terms of the role models of the leadership that we have, not necessarily outstanding human beings, regardless of where you lie on the political spectrum. And so in the absence of that, I think people are searching for father figures. They look for these role models. And unfortunately, though, the algorithm of these social media companies reinforces the provocative, outrageous, and extreme versions of it. They're almost like caricatures of masculinity. The very sadistic warrior archetype, if you're, neo-Jungian and read Robert Moore's work. I actually had a Twitter thread about this, and I was like, can you name a masculine and warm influencer these days?
Yeah, I recall.
Hard time coming up with them. And the funny thing is, I was like, all the ones that I came up with were basically people who existed in the pre-social media era. And I was like, right. Dr. Wayne Dwyer was a good example. Robert Moore, actually, I think was a good example. Maybe Steve Harvey these days, I think is actually rather warm.
Would you call Joe Rogan warm?
Kind of. I think he's more funny.
Cuddly.
I think he's more funny than cuddly. I don't think you need to be cuddly, that kind of warm. But just think about like a warm father figure who's like affectionate and caring, But Jason Williams, I thought, was a really good example. I actually encourage people. He wrote "Cry Like a Man" and "Battle Cry." But yeah, there's so few of them, and I think without that, men are very lost, and they're really seeking it, right? And my concern is that there's going to be a generation of men who grow up very stilted because they almost get these extreme mixed messages from the various sides of the socio-political spectrum, and they really do not know how to be as a man. Where in traditional society, it was your father, obviously, who played that role. But also, it's not just reliant on the father. It was other male, older members of the community, your older cousins, brothers, uncle figures, that also give you alternative points of view of how to be a man. Because your father is an imperfect person, right? He can't just be the only masculine archetype for you. In addition to that, you had teachers, coaches, maybe you had a psychologist or a therapist. So maybe non-familial older male role models that teach you how to be a man. Although I would say in pre-college education, there's very few male teachers anymore, right? So there's you don't get that influence outside of maybe sports coaches. And so I think a lot of that is sort of missing. And I think the mental health effects of that are apparent because men do not know how to conduct themselves, don't know how to honestly operate effectively in interpersonal relationships with women. Because of the crazy toxic messages, I would say, that they're sort of getting from sort of the manosphere, red pill sort of community. And also you have this weird generational times of high rates of addiction to internet and social media, almost like social agoraphobia in terms of staying at home, not going to school, remote work, which is not honestly good for most people's mental well-being. And I can't tell you how many people come and tell me like how awkward essentially this generation has become because they don't know how to maintain eye contact, have normal interpersonal interactions because they've almost missed out on that. So I think, I know it's a long-winded answer, but there's just a lot of factors that are happening, and I'm happy to, unwind any of these threads. But
no, I think you nailed so much of it. And you bring up on your social media this concept of tonic masculinity. Right. I'm curious what that would look like to you. Like, what is the concept of tonic masculinity? I do like all the videos of tonic masculinity of like a guy just being so kind and just doing great feats. But what does tonic masculinity mean to you?
Yeah, the great thing about that is instead of explaining it, we show it.
Right.
And I was like, what better demonstration is of that than showing videos of men being good men? And so what are the videos of? It's Kobe Bryant being a good girl dad, being a supportive father. And he's obviously a tough, like super one of the toughest people you could imagine, but like, relatively sensitive in the context of his fatherhood. Guys using their strength for good, literally rescuing animals, who are in dire, dangerous situations. There was a video I posted of this guy talking to like a drug dealer on the street and having kind of an emotional conversation with him and realizing that he lost his parents and his grandmother. And there's a lot of obviously trauma that was unwound there. So I think I want to counteract sort of the narrative that masculinity is inherently toxic. My argument is that both masculinity and femininity in their mature forms, which is obviously what we're striving towards, is tonic or healing. And I actually think it is a really positive force in society that we should encourage. And so, the hashtag has almost taken on a life of its own. I don't even post videos around it, but you'll see people posting with that hashtag, because society needs good men just as it needs good women. But we need to, through sort of demonstration, essentially model that for people. And obviously, if you read your Bandura's social learning theory in grad school, like that's the best way people learn, is they need demonstration from other people about how to be. And then if they don't have father figures, they can at least learn vicariously. That's why I was saying, actually, I have a theory about sort of male role models and father figures, which is there's almost layers of it. And the best way is actually to have one of each. The top layer is like, ideally you have father, literal father. If you don't have that, and even in addition to that, even if you do, then your uncles, brothers, cousins, then your teachers, coaches, psychologists, and then it's your living role models. Like you're a fan of LeBron James or whoever athlete that every boy like has a poster on their wall, and there's a reason for it. I think it's a deep psychological need to have heroes, right?
Yeah.
People that we look up to, Messi or whoever it is. And then the last layer is actually, I think, historical figures. They don't even need to be alive. You can learn from biographies about how to be a good man, right? There's a guy actually on Twitter, Quintus Curtius, that like writes a book, The Lives of the Great Commanders. And it's like, great, if you're an ambitious person, you should, like Mike Tyson did. He studied all the great commanders in history because he was like, it's the art of warfare. So, and my argument is you should actually have all 5 of these things, ideally, because you'll learn different things from different people. And like Bruce Lee said in his sort of Tao of Jeet Kune Do, you take what's useful and leave the rest. One person is an inherently flawed human being. And so you'll never get a full, robust archetype of what a sort of a complete, resplendent human being is from one person. And so I think you can draw upon literally social, historical, present, and familial, examples of that in order to learn in your own value system, how do I want to be as a man?
Right. So I'm hearing like there's this issue of like having no direction, and then also also the traits that you're seeing in men are kind of shown to be or kind of labeled as toxic, and then it's like, what's this replacement? And there's like an absence of like healthy, good replacements and messages society's giving men of what does it mean to be a good man, and kind of like giving a lot of encouragement to that end. So I think that's an awesome point. Do you see your company as a force for helping that? I mean, given that it's in your social media, like how could your company potentially have that kind of societal influence, to help men kind of be their best?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the sort of like the seated mission of the company in a lot of ways, in my opinion, is actually to pass the torch of the Poetic Men's Movement. So if people aren't familiar with that, Robert Bly back in the day wrote a
Which movement?
It's called the Mythopoetic Men's Movement. So back in the 1990s, Robert Bly wrote a best-selling book called Iron John, which is sort of a Jungian analysis of a famous fairy tale called Iron John. And the book was just a smash hit. It was like, I think it was like 50 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. And it was kind of a total surprise because Bly is a poet and a professor of poetry. Like he's an academic, and the book is actually kind of dense. And so why did this book have this like resonance in American society? This very esoteric book, literally about a fairy tale, because the fairy tale was basically a template of how a boy becomes a man, right? And it was his sort of exegesis or explanation of this almost is like the hero's journey, if you read Joseph Campbell, of how to do that. And like I said, I think in a society that is seeking that guidance and is lacking the traditional initiation from boyhood into manhood, the book had this resonance, and it sparked what was called the Mythopoetic Men's Movement, in which Bly and a lot of his great colleagues, anthropologists, poets, professors, Michael Mead, Malidoma, Robert Moore, a lot of these great figures who I actually think were actually really great masculine role models would go and present at an annual conference called the Minnesota Men's Conference, and hold workshops around the country. Back in the day, they were also criticized because, like, these guys are going off for the weekend doing these drum circles and letting out their feelings.
Right.
And they kind of almost got this painted with this neo-hippie vibe. But if you, the recordings of these are all on YouTube. You can just look up Minnesota Men's Conference. And I think it's honestly some of the best content that exists on YouTube. It's a bold claim, but it's all pre-social media, right? There's all audio recordings. They didn't even have the videos up. But they're wonderful stories and life lessons. And there's like, there's a great, for instance, conference I think that did back in San Francisco called Men in the Life of Desire. And they blend literally mythology and poetry. And we're trying to play this role of initiating men, giving them a safe space to get into their feelings, in which there's no other venues for that in modern society anymore. And unfortunately, the movement died. And the movement died because literally a lot of these guys aged out. Robert Bly, in fact, passed away this year. I think he was in his 90s. And it never sort of like, there was no someone passing the torch, so to speak. And so I think in a lot of ways, the mission of the company, Maximus, is to pass that torch on. Now, obviously, we're doing it in a different form as a telemedicine company. But the content that we put out on social media, doing these podcasts with you, the radio show that we do, I talk a lot more than just about hormones. I always, in fact, say that like testosterone is kind of like a sexy Trojan horse that gets people in the door, right?
Right.
Because, I mean, yeah, we all do want to look, feel, and perform better. And I don't have anything against, cosmetic pharmacology or vanity. But once we get people in the door, I always tell people, I was like, if you really want to maximize not only your health, but your overall well-being and satisfaction, and have a full and meaningful life, you better start getting into the psychological side of things. And I think the thing is, you almost have to like demonstrate that and almost like slowly feed people with that. You start people with the medication and they're like, okay, my energy level's better, my motivation's better. Great. Now what do I do with that energy?
Right, exactly.
Right. Now I can channel it obviously in a really like unproductive direction, which we obviously don't want people to delve into sexual addiction, compulsivity, etc. But if they are channeling obviously in a positive direction, right, which is the tonic masculinity stuff, then people can reap a lot of benefits. And that's where I think content and education and values play a really big role. And that's what we try to do with our content is like, okay, great. Now if I double your testosterone, you go act like a douchebag. I think I've contributed to
You'll be twice the douchebag.
Yeah, exactly. But that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying
Exactly.
I think, in fact, the best way we can help women and society is to build better men, right? Who are not just healthier, but more complete as human beings. And that's why, like, literally at the call-in radio show last night, I'm answering questions about weight loss and nutrition optimization. But I started it out with this whole unpopular opinion about sort of this like need for warm masculine role models. Why am I talking about masculine role models at a hormone company? It's because I think it's really necessary, if we're going to be holistic about it, to dribble and give people treats in order to sort of get them to realize that there's a deeper well to drink from, right? And you can't, obviously, you can only lead a horse to water. You can't make them drink, as I like to say. There's some people who just want to take our medications, feel better. That's fine. That's all they're going to get out of it. But as you know, from the trans theoretical model, people are going to be at different stages of change and ready to change at different times. And so maybe 3 months in, they go through a bad breakup and they're like, okay, maybe there is some little bit more personal development work that I need to do. And I'll delve a little bit more into that. And they get that as part of being a subscriber to our company. So I think that's the best way that I know of, at least, in order to help people, is, to get them tied in to some sort of service or subscription or community in which they're involved on an ongoing basis. And you're providing them with tools and resources. And when they're ready, they can take advantage of that and take advantage of that in order to become better.
Love it. Love it. That sounds great. And it harkens back to that viral Jordan Peterson soundbite about like being like a total monster, and then like really learning how to control that and learning how to channel that into very positive things in the world. And it sounds like you're doing amazing work, and keep it up. It was such great, privilege talking to you.
I appreciate it. I think there's a similar sentiment of better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war, right? So
Yeah.
I do think it's actually an imperative for men to, develop their health, masculinity, and strength, literally, and channel that in a way that's positive and pro-social and productive. So I think that's really critical.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And how can people reach you if they want to learn more?
Yeah, my social media handle is Cam Maximus. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram. Twitter more for the ideas, Instagram a little bit more for inspiration. But we also have our weekly call and radio show every Thursday at 6 o'clock Pacific time. You can find those on all the social media channels as well. So I actually encourage people, it's not just for subscribers, people who are prospective members or just, if you are literally any guy out there is looking for guidance or support, encourage that. And then we have a community as well. So you can join that for free. It's actually maximustribe.com/Discord. We host it on a platform called Discord. And same thing, we open it up free for the community as well. It's actually what we call mutual improvement. I actually have a thesis that self-improvement was never meant to be done alone. It's a very like hyper individualistic American ideal that, the lone wolf that needs to improve themselves. When, every psychologist knows that social support, accountability, all of these things increase the odds of it happening. And so we literally have a health coaching channel. If you want to hop in and, work on your health behavior goals, productivity, et cetera, and you want other guys who will support you and keep you accountable and give you praise and maybe a little tough love if you're not doing it as well, it'll increase the odds of you sticking to them, and also learning from guys. We have people who are 18-year-old college freshmen to hedge fund managers with 3 kids and everything in between. And so I think America is really lacking in that community, and providing that through the company, even for free, I think is an important public service. So I'd love to have people join us on social media and our community.
That's so great. And thanks for all you do. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for all you do. I think it's great that you, I think, are not only a good masculine role model, but one of the few male psychologists that are left. And we need more of them. I think it's important to obviously have great female and male psychologists, but when there's a dearth of male psychologists, it's to the point that it's clearly unbalanced now. I think it's important for guys to have that these days. So I think you're doing just as important of a public service.
I really appreciate it. All right.